Alrighty, well, we might have a couple of late arrivals, and I'll, just let them in as they come. But welcome to session 2 of the 2021 virtual Cape Cod Convocation. We are going to sort of do a similar thing to the first session. Please put your questions in the chat. Everybody's on mute now. If you do have a question that comes up during the presentation and you want to speak out, that's fine, and we'll have some chance for discussion because we'll have a little bit of a smaller group towards the end during the question section. We are planning to reserve some of the time at the end of the session to answer any questions that folks might have. Again, this session will be recorded, so folks can access the videos after the session. Use the chat if you have any questions or immediate concerns during the presentation. And with that, let's see if I can get the screen share to work. So welcome to the session. I'm Mead Binhammer. I'm the Land Stewardship Assistant with Buzzards Bay Coalition. I take the lead on a lot of our signage on fee properties, and I'm going to speak to that a bit today. With me today is Christine Bates. Christine is the Visitor Services and Community Outreach Coordinator with Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. She has a wealth of experience both designing signs as well as creating unique visitor experiences on Cape Cod. And she's going to share a little bit of that expertise with us today. So we're really grateful to have you, Christine. And with that, I'll sort of let you start.
Sure. Yeah, so let's see, can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, so as Mead mentioned, I'm the Visitor Experiences and Community Outreach Coordinator at Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. And so part of what I do is work with our property identification and interpretive signage on our property. So there's a number of different types of signage that Mead and I will be getting into today in our presentation. I'll be touching on the first things we're seeing here: accessibility and inclusivity, identification signage, welcome panels, and interpretive signage. And then I'll pass it over to Mead. So can we move on to the next one, Mead? All right, so when we're talking about communicating effectively with signage, obviously to be as effective as possible, we need to have signage that is usable by the most people possible. So Mass Audubon is now in the process of developing new signage standards. And you'll be seeing this at our properties. You may have already seen some of our new signage, but we are rolling this out, and we're hopeful that soon all signage statewide will be replaced to our new signage standards. And one of the big things that we have taken into account with our new signage standards is accessibility and inclusivity. So in our new signage standards, we have added Spanish to everything. So traditionally, we only used English, but we realized that about 9.5% of people in our state are, native Spanish speakers. So in order to reach more people, we've added Spanish to cover approximately 90% of who could be coming to our properties. Now, that is a statewide standard that Mass Audubon as an organization has developed because we are across the whole state. Thinking about a lot of the organizations represented here and Southeastern Massachusetts, perhaps Spanish would not make as much sense. So knowing the demographics of where you are is very important to making these types of decisions and making your signage as effective as possible. So I know that a lot of communities in Southeastern Massachusetts, there's a larger Portuguese speaking population. So look at your census data. If the surrounding communities for a property that you're doing signage for has a significantly higher Portuguese population than the rest of the state, consider incorporating that into your standards for your signage at that property. Another thing that we have added to our signage for Mass Audubon, particularly for our large property identification signs, is this "All Are Welcome" tag. And something that we've become aware of as an organization is that a lot of people think of Mass Audubon as a membership organization, which is great. But we don't want people to be discouraged from coming to our properties because they aren't members. So in order to let everybody know that you don't have to be a member, you don't have to buy a membership, anybody can come use our land, we have added that all are welcome tag. Another thing that has changed for us over the past several years is that the word society is no longer a part of our brand identification. And this goes along with the all are welcome concept. The word society can imply exclusivity. So we are now Mass Audubon, and we kind of made that official switch a couple years ago. So just making it a little bit more accessible for everybody. All right, next slide, me. Okay, great. So that first sign I showed is a very large sign on Route 6 that's going to be going up very soon for those of you familiar with our property. This sign example here is at the end of our driveway. So this is another example of property identification signage. And this is adhering to our new standards. So something that you'll notice is the use of icons, whereas, we used to use a lot more text, no dogs, that type of thing. Using icons, as long as they are able to obviously portray the activities that they're supposed to portray, is a good way to kind of get past that language barrier, having some universal images as opposed to a lot of text. And also, as far as visibility is concerned, you're not cluttering up your signage with a whole lot of text. Another thing, we're really focusing now with our signage on making people feel welcome. And part of that is being very thoughtful about the amount of quote unquote no messaging that we have, particularly on our welcome signs. And this is kind of a challenge because we are, responsible for protecting wildlife and the resources on our properties and balancing that with visitor experiences. So there are some things that aren't allowed that people need to be made aware of to protect the integrity of our lands. But that being said, being very thoughtful about people arriving at properties and being presented with the things that they're able to do, making them feel welcome instead of bombarding them with a lot of no messaging. So we've decided that the biggest issue that we have on our property is people bringing dogs. We don't allow dogs. So that's been the one no message that we've incorporated into this sign. And we've been very thoughtful about removing some of our other no signage for things that we recognize are not as significant issues and aren't worth kind of cluttering up our view shed and our landscape with some of this kind of negative messaging. So next slide. All right, another piece, particularly with accessibility, is the visibility of signage. So thinking about for those who have visual impairments, how can you make your signs as readable as possible? Part of what we've done in our new signage is really just cut down to the bare minimum. You'll notice we don't even have the word wildlife sanctuary on a lot of our signage anymore, so that we can have larger, bolder text that can be seen better from a distance. And also thinking about how people are arriving at your property. In our circumstance, we're located on Route 6, so people could be driving 50 miles per hour. So, if you're on a quiet road where somebody's approaching the property going 15, it may not be as essential to really cut down that text. But in a place where people are going to be approaching quickly, thinking about them really being able to key in on that text. The other thing that I'll mention is using some reflective elements. Now, this kind of depends on the uses of your property. So for us, we do fairly regularly hold things like night hikes, and we have a nature center, we have evening programs there. So it makes sense for us to have some reflective elements as well to make it accessible and visible, even at night. Other properties, if you're not open at all after dark, doesn't make any sense for you. But in our situation, that was something we took into consideration. All right, next. Next one, Mead. There we go. Okay, so welcome panels. look different properties. Some will use more of a kiosk. For our properties at Mass Audubon, we use, vertical, large welcome panels. And for each property, there are 2 panels. This is the first panel for Drumlin Farm, one of our newly produced panels. We don't have one yet for Wellfleet Bay. I'm looking forward to it when we do. And I realize that you can't read everything here on the sign, but on the left-hand column is English, right-hand column is in Spanish. And this is your opportunity to set the stage for visitors to have a successful experience at your property. So in order to do that, think about things like letting them know what they're able to do there, giving them clear messages about what they're not able to do there. It's also a good opportunity to provide people with a little bit of an overview of your organization. On the right-hand side of this panel, under the Northern Parula there, we have our mission statement. Also, perhaps a property may have an interesting acquisition story or an interesting historical story to show. That might be something you could incorporate into a welcome panel as well. So going along with that same messaging about focusing on what people can do, start off by presenting, in this situation, it's saying you can go for a hike, you can visit the farm, you can do a class, that type of thing. And then the other half of the panel I'll show you in just a minute, and you will see we do also include our regulations on here because obviously that's important. But really be as clear and concise as possible. And I'll be talking about this a little bit more with interpretive signage, but the more text you have on a sign, the less likely people are to read it. So really focus in on your messaging. Okay, next, Mead. Okay, so that Drumlin Farm panel before, that was the left-hand panel on one of our welcome panels. On the right here, you're seeing what the right-hand side of that welcome panel looks like. And I really wanted to highlight the new maps that we're unrolling for all Mass Audubon properties because I'm really excited about them. If you look to the left, this is what our maps have looked like for our wildlife sanctuaries. And it's pretty obvious looking at that it's not the most user-friendly map. I think it's a little bit more cartoony and not necessarily as accurate and usable as most visitors would be looking for. So we've made much more accurate maps that are easier to use, and those are incorporated now. You'll notice, actually you might not notice because it's such small text, but we do have all of the icons in the key on the map are in English and Spanish. They are not in English and Spanish on the map itself, just because that is too much, too many labels, too many words on the map, kind of cluttering that up. So we just stuck with that in our key. And then you'll look below the map and you will see our list of safety and considerations for the property and regulations as well, both in English and Spanish. All right, next one, Mead. Okay, so moving on to another type of signage, interpretive signage. And in particular, something that a lot of our properties have, which are wayside exhibits. So when I say wayside exhibit, I'm talking about an educational interpretive signage along the side of a trail that is interpreting some sort of aspect of the landscape there. And when deciding whether or not it's worth having a wayside exhibit, there are a few things to keep in mind. One of which is, do you have the right kind of set of conditions to have an effective wayside exhibit opportunity? One of which is something that is an obvious feature that people would be curious about. So in this situation, the sign that I'm showing here is from Allen's Pond. And this is located looking right at the salt marsh. So it's obviously connected to the landscape. It's kind of a wide open vista, something that people may be naturally curious about. A lot of properties have good opportunities with, foundations or historic structures, any big obvious landscape features that your visitors would very likely be curious about. Then they'll see that picture on the sign and say, oh, I was wondering about this. And And there are lots of stories to tell in our properties that don't have those significant landscape features attached to them. And those probably aren't going to be the best stories to try and use interpretive signage for. Also, using a site-specific high-quality image. So you'll see here, this is taken at Allen's Pond from the viewpoint, high-quality image draws you in. That's going to help make your signage more effective as well. And the siting, so a safe and accessible site. You need to make sure you put it somewhere where it's not in the middle of the trail, somewhere where a group of people could gather around the sign without impeding the flow of traffic for the trail system, or without having somebody in the group being out in the middle of the road or anything like that. So thinking a lot about where you're actually putting it. And finally, with any signage, a real key thing to think about is maintenance, and factoring that into your planning when you're deciding on putting out signage. Will you have funding 5 years from now when the sign is starting to fade and peel to replace that sign? You don't want to just stick something out there and not have a plan for maintaining it and replacing it. All right, next. And so just a couple of best practices when you are developing interpretive signage. The example that I've included here, this image is from Fort Hill. It's Cape Cod National Seashore. National Park Service has done a lot of really wonderful wayside exhibits at Cape Cod National Seashore. And they do have the National Park Service in general has some really good online resources about developing wayside exhibits, which I encourage you to look into. So each panel must stand alone. What I mean by that is there are opportunities. There could be a large vista where you may have 3 different interpretive signs, wayside exhibits, using those interchangeably. And each of those needs to tell its own story. You can't assume that your visitors are going to come and read each sign from left to right. So the information should not be depending on information in other signs. In case that visitor just sees one sign, they're drawn to that, they can get a message just from that sign. 4th grade reading level. This is just a standard recommendation for exhibit text in general. It's most museums kind of try to adhere to that depending on who their audience is. Use headlines, have some bold text at the top that really summarizes what you're going to be learning about to draw people in. And once you develop some text and have a draft of a sign, seek some feedback from outside sources. So, you know, our friends and colleagues at our conservation organizations are definitely great to reach out to as well. But think about somebody who maybe doesn't have that kind of conservation, nature-oriented mindset. The casual visitor who might just be walking their dog. Is this going to make sense to them without having the background information that a lot of us do? So ask others to take a look at it and point out places where you may be making some assumptions about knowledge. And a couple just general statistics here at the bottom. And these have really come out of a lot of research from museums, but if we're thinking about interpretive signage and waysides as basically outdoor museum exhibits, so it can be applicable for us too. The longer the text, the less likely it is to be read. So when you are developing signage, being concise is really important. If you are overwhelming your audience with a whole bunch of text, chances are they're not going to take the time to read it. The most read texts are about things. So, you know, having that connection between your sign and something very visible and obvious. The least read texts are about ideas. So those things that are not as concrete. And then visitors, you can expect them to read about 20% of the text. So, you know, get the most important messaging right in the beginning and kind of be very thoughtful about what you put where in your signage. All right, next. And finally, I just included one more example of some interpretive signage produced by Mass Audubon. This is for Allen's Pond, a site I know many of you are familiar with down in Westport. And once again, that kind of cementing it with a high quality image that is about whatever is going to be covered, having a large, bold headline as well, keeping the text brief. This sign has a little bit more text than I probably would have put in it, to be honest, but the whole sign is not covered with signage, or excuse me, with text, which is makes it more visually appealing and more likely to be read. All right, so I'm gonna pass it on over to you, Mead.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for all those lessons about welcome and interpretive signage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trail directional signage. I'm also going to talk a little bit about trail markers and blazing. But first, we're going to start with trail directional signage. So we know that good signage is imperative to our land trust properties and to our trails. Good signage, as this quote from the National Park Service signage guidelines sort of illustrates, it can make up for other deficiencies in our trail systems, like the lack of trail maintenance or a difficult to follow trail. If we have good signage, it can really leave the visitor with a good taste in their mouth and contribute to a positive visitor experience on our trail. So Christine recommended the National Park Service guide to Wayside Exhibits. I would also recommend looking at their trail signage guidelines. They have, a really good resource for where you should be putting signs, how to keep your signs consistent, and also some tips on blazing and trail marking. So we know we need good trail signage to contribute to a positive visitor experience. So how do we get there from here? How do we design trail signage for our new trail? Well, the first piece of advice I'd give to everyone as they're thinking about trail signage is to create a trail signage plan. Maybe you have a new conservation property, you've just built a trail, it's an out and back trail. We want to sit down with a paper map and a Sharpie or a pencil and find all of the confusing points in that trail system, all of the sections where maybe there's a trail intersection or the trail gets close to private property. Those locations are the ones you're going to want to have a sign at. Creating that cohesive plan is really going to help you to find the most important points to have signage and also help you to avoid putting up too many signs. So the locations where you're really going to need those signs are at trail intersections. On the left here is a photo where the sort of spur trail encounters another trail that leads off to the right to go on a loop. So that's going to be an important point for a sign. Any entrance to the trail is also going to be an important point for a sign to let people know that this is where they embark on their walk. As well as destinations or landmarks along the trail system might warrant a sign, and especially on an out and back trail, some sort of signage that indicates returning to the parking area. This helps folks feel comfortable as they are returning towards their car, that they're actually headed in the right direction. You'll notice on both of these signs that we've kept the text to an absolute minimum. So it's just the name of the trail and an arrow, or the name of the location that they're headed towards and an arrow, as well as a trail distance. And we find the trail distances can really be helpful towards a visitor planning their hike. We've all probably had an experience where we've started on a trail and expected a 15-minute walk, and 45 minutes later we've only gone halfway. And so by giving a distance, it helps a visitor approximate how long they'll actually be out on that trail. And then the real key here is that we want to be careful not to put up too many trail signs or to be redundant with our trail signs. We want to be direct and to the point and only install signs in the locations where it's absolutely necessary. So oftentimes, right along with trail directional signage, the conversation steers towards trail marking and putting up blazes along our trails. And there's definitely differing views on this. Buzzards Bay Coalition, we often opt not to blaze and just use trail signage to keep visitors on the trail. But we do recognize that there are other locations where it might be really helpful, and then there are some locations where it might be just unnecessary. If you have a lot of confusing points on your trail, or if your organization has made a commitment to putting up trail markers, then you really want to follow the best practices to have those be consistent and be easy for the visitor to use. So I have two examples on the slide. On the left-hand photo is a picture of a side trail off of the Long Trail in the Liebrook Wilderness of Vermont. You see there's one blue blaze on a spruce tree in the foreground, and you don't see a single other blaze along the trail. The next blaze is probably 100 meters, maybe 200 meters ahead. It acts as a reassurance to the hiker that, hey, you're still on the trail, you're doing all right. But it's not overwhelming to see multiple blazes. And then on the right, we see a bad example of trail marking where this is in Crawford Notch State Park in New Hampshire, where you see about 6 blazes in this single photo, and it gets confusing. It also seems like there's just a bunch of paint in the woods, and that's kind of out of place. You're distracted from this beautiful forest you're walking through, and it also can be confusing to the hiker because with so many blazes, it's almost hard to follow the trail here. So the best rule of thumb is if you can see 2 blazes at any point in your trail system, you have too many. Of course, the exception being a turn. But if you can see two different trees with blazes, you might want to reconsider and just do one. So other things to consider when you're considering putting up trail signage are sort of these 3 questions, one of which is, does your trail intersect private property, maybe a private driveway or a private trail? These might be locations that warrant additional signage. In the upper left photo here, we have a trail in Fairhaven that crosses some private farmland. And so this is actually a hayfield used by the farmer. We have some signage up that indicates to users that this is private property and to please respect the surrounding farmland and stay on the trail. Another important question is, does your trail pass or does it get near a sensitive ecological or cultural resource? We don't really have examples of that here, but in other locations, maybe an alpine zone would be a location that you would want to have an additional trail sign. Here, we might consider the same for a trail that nears a salt marsh or some sort of other, a vernal pool or a sensitive ecological resource. And then the last is, does your trail have a destination? And if that destination isn't obvious, maybe you should consider installing some signage to let folks know that they've reached whatever the destination may be. So on the lower right here too, we have another trail that nears a private property, and we've installed some symbolic split rail fencing and a sign that asks folks to respect the neighboring private property and return to the trail system. And so these are another couple sort of illustrations of those points. On the lower left here, you see a trail that gets pretty near a sensitive salt marsh, and we have a sign installed there that asks visitors to please respect the salt marsh habitat and stay behind the fence. On the right, we have another example from the Long Trail of Vermont. This is actually on Mount Mansfield, and this is several signs, but they sort of illustrate a couple of the points I was just talking about. One is the destination. So this is the second highest peak on Mount Mansfield. It's the end to a lot of visitors hike. So having a sign that indicates that they have arrived at the forehead might be their endpoint, and so that's helpful for them to know. It also is a sensitive ecological resource area. It's an alpine area, so there's a special regulation. If we think about sort of an example here, maybe you have a trail that crosses a beach where there's piping plovers nesting, similar to the interpretive sign that Christine showed at Allen's Pond. We might have a sign there that asks folks to leash their dogs or to refrain from bringing their dogs in that area. Anywhere where you're going to have a special rule for a portion of your trail system, you might consider installing some signage to that effect. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of temporary or special condition signage. So, one of these special conditions, of course, is the global pandemic. COVID-19, we've seen a lot of land trusts and conservation organizations install new signage along their trails to inform visitors of that effect. This is an example of Buzzards Bay Coalition's COVID-19 response sign. You know, we might have a little bit too much text here, but one of the things that I think was really important in the sign is using graphics so that it's really easy to see, okay, well, we should stay 6 feet away and follow follow the state guidelines when it comes to COVID-19. You might also consider installing some seasonal signage, particularly if you have special conditions on your property, if you say allow hunting on your property, or if you have a particularly wet trail that should be avoided during certain times of the year, you might want to put up some seasonal signage. On the right here is an example of Buzzards Bay Coalition sign that we put up around hunting season that informs visitors that there is hunting in the area and that hunters should be respectful of hikers and hikers of hunters. And so this might be, some signage that you would consider installing in the fall and the spring. And the last type of signage that I'll bring up is property-specific signage. Maybe you have a certain issue on a single property that you're managing, and you need to install some signage to that effect. On the right here, this is not from New England or Massachusetts. This is actually from just outside of Arches National Park in the Southwest. And clearly they have an issue with dog waste on this property. So they've installed some signage asking people to please clean up after your dog. And you might have a similar condition with either dog waste or repeated fires, something like that, where you need to install some special condition signage in an area. So some quick trail sign takeaways. So having a really consistent, well-designed sign scheme is really key to a positive visitor experience. It can also make up for other trail issues like a lack of trail maintenance or a confusing trail system. If you have good signs, they'll really contribute to a positive visitor experience. The other key thing that I'll bring up again is that creating a signage plan, actually, printing off a paper map and making a plan of where you're going to install your signs and which sections really need it is going to be really important. And when you're doing that, you want to think about walking the trail in a visitor's shoes. If it's somebody's first time taking a hike on this trail, where might they need more information? Maybe you walk it with someone who's never been to the trail before and see where they get confused. And those are the locations you're probably going to need some signage. And lastly, just be really deliberate about where you're putting up your signs and making sure that you're not putting up too many. And we don't want to detract from the visitor experience by having a sign around every turn. So really be cognizant of that and just keep it to where it makes sense and where it's really needed. So the next thing I'm going to get into is a brief sort of start to finish of how you can create a signage plan for your property. So we're calling this new acquisition Conserved Land Preserve. This is a fee property that our land trust just acquired. And what we've done, it's about a 20-acre property, and we've created a lollipop trail system on it. The trail system here is outlined in these white dash marks. We're about to create a parking area along the road, so we'll have some road frontage. And then on the right here, you'll see we have some sort of special, unique conditions to this property. We have an old logging road that we used for a portion of our trail. And so that might be confusing to a visitor if they get up to this logging road and they think the trail goes both ways. We also have two locations down here in the south where neighbors have historically accessed the property. They have a private trail from their backyard to get into this property. And then we have two kind of cool ecological and historical vistas. So we have one emergent wetland overlook where you get a great view out into this pond in the spring and emergent wetland in the summer and fall. Where we might want to, illustrate some thoughts about that wetland. And we also have an old factory foundation that can be found on the property that depicts the former industrial use of the property. So where should we put the signage? Well, first, we should think about putting a property identification sign. If we're going to have a parking area for a couple cars off the road here, it's important to have some sort of welcoming sign that that lets folks know that they've arrived at the property and it's open to the public. Next, we might think about adding some welcome signage, which includes maybe the rules and the activities that you can do on the property, as well as a map. This was sort of the welcome to the property. It lets folks know, where they can go and what they can do, and contributes to a positive experience while they're on the property. Next, we have several locations which need trail directional signage. The first of which is this intersection right here that I'm illustrating with my cursor, where the property or the trail system encounters a old logging road. So we're going to want to have a trail sign here that indicates the trail actually goes over to the east here. We're also going to want to have a trail sign right at the intersection, letting folks know that the loop goes both ways and they can kind of choose their own adventure from there. We might want to give a trail distance here that lets folks know how long the loop is. And then we're also going to want to have some private property signs. These two trails from private residences get really close to our trail system. We want folks to stay within the land trust property, so we might, consider putting up some signs that say, private trail, land trust trail leads this way or something. And we also would like to do that here at the end of the logging road. If visitors are exploring the rest of this logging road, we want to let them know that they're exiting the land trust property and entering into this private land. The last couple of signs that we might consider are interpretive signs or wayside exhibits. We have a really fabulous overlook here where we might want to illustrate some of the ecological characteristics of this emergent wetland. So maybe we talk a little bit about the reptiles and amphibians that can be found in there, maybe some of the fish or waterfowl, and include a really nice photo of this vista as a background. And also we have an old factory foundation where, this was the former industrial use of the property. We might want to illustrate, the details of that factory and the history of this property at that location. And with that, by creating this sort of cohesive signage plan, we know exactly, where we want our signage installed. We're not sort of doing it in an ad hoc manner. So we're keeping the signs to a minimum, but also contributing to the overall visitor experience by putting up sufficient signs and sort of illustrating the story of the location. So with that, I will open it up to any questions, and feel free to write them in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask. I think we have a small enough group here that if you want to just unmute yourself and ask any questions, that would be terrific.
I do see one comment in here from Kevin Galligan. He says that he thinks Alex is on from OCT and that Alex has been putting temporary signs when a site restoration project is underway for inquiring minds who pass by. I actually recently saw one of those about, I believe it was privet removal at Twining's Pond. So it is effective. It did the job for me, that's for sure, because we were wondering as we approached the site what was going on. And that's something we do at Mass Audubon too. If you have like an active ecological landscape project going on, people are going to ask about that. So it's a good opportunity. And I don't know if Alex wants to share anything from his experience if he's on, or but yeah, it's another really good opportunity to have some interpretive signage. And we have another question here from Mike, and it is, do you install signs at the neighbor boundaries with a message to visitors entering from side paths, especially with motorized vehicles?
Yeah, I'm happy to field that. So I would say occasionally, where it makes sense. Oftentimes what, in our experience, what we do that seems to work well is similar to sort of those split rail fences that we installed along sensitive ecological habitats. We might install a symbolic section of fencing that allows walkers to easily get around it, while just installing a sign that says something like entering Buzzards Bay Coalition conservation land, walkers welcome, or something like that. So I think there are circumstances where that might be warranted, and then there are other circumstances where it may not be necessary. Any other questions, comments in the?
Here we go. We've got one from Tasia Blau. Have you or anyone had a situation where they will need ongoing and variable signs, and in doing so, transitioning a kiosk with bulletin board to a more professional sign on the kiosk? Hold on, let me look at this again. So kind of going from having temporary changing signs to a more permanent type of signage. I'm trying to think. Yes, I believe. I'm trying to think about my experience at Wellfleet Bay. We have am I doing transition kiosk with both? We do have both a kiosk that we have temporary signage at, and we have our permanent welcome panels. So we have the advantage of kind of having both of those. And I do think there is an advantage to keeping a kiosk and some sort of bulletin board at the entryway to a trail system or a property because of things like COVID-19, all of these temporary signage needs that we have. But if you're able to have both, I think that's very helpful to both have somewhere to put temporary signage and to take the time to put together a permanent, more professional sign. I don't know, do you have anything to add to that, Mead?
I just think that the only thing that I'll add is that sort of the key there with especially the bulletin board type signage is just keeping up with it, making sure you don't have any signs that are out of date, or signs that are no longer relevant. They can contribute to clutter, and as Christine mentioned, your average visitor, especially as they're just embarking on their walk, is only going to read maybe one of those signs in your bulletin board. So making sure you keep it to a minimum, but communicate the things you need. So I see a question here about talking a little bit further about blazing versus trail markers or arrows, pros and cons, using one versus using the other. So I think they can kind of be used interchangeably. I mean, one thing about using a painted blaze versus using a trail marker or a trail arrow is that it's less susceptible to vandalism. So if you are in a site where you might be concerned about vandalism, a painted blaze, while it will require more maintenance, is less susceptible to being vandalized. The other thing that we've noticed is that, especially with trail arrows, those can be, just sort of easily vandalized, as in folks might flip them around or, make them more confusing than they need to be. So I find either a trail marker, there's simple sort of $1 square trail markers that you can purchase with your land trust name right on them, or a trail blaze can be used pretty interchangeably.
Yeah, we have a comment from Alex Bates from Orleans Conservation Trust. OCT uses our land management signs to help educate the users of our trails. The signs include our contact information if people have additional questions. We laminate the signs and attach them to a 4x4 post. And great. And I think that a good point that he makes here is that all the signage has contact information. So, having contact information, a website, phone number, any of that, you should definitely make sure you're incorporating something like that into your signage, especially for something like a land management project where, you know, it could be controversial in some way. It's nice for people to be able to follow up if they really have any more questions or concerns.
Does anyone use QR codes? So yes, the short answer is yes. Occasionally we use QR codes for trail maps. So we will use Avenza maps. And so occasionally we'll use a QR code for that. I've seen other land trusts in the area use QR codes for like to access their general web page, maybe a membership web page. So I think there are examples where it can make sense to use a QR code. Again, just making sure that it's, you know, well designed and simple, and that it doesn't result in additional clutter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something Mass Audubon, our new signage standards, were not incorporating QR codes. And I guess, I mean, you could go either way. I think anything that's kind of technology based, you got to think about the longevity of that. And if you want to have that sign up there, if it's a permanent sign that you're hoping is going to last you 15 years, you know, chances are 10, 15 years from now, QR codes probably aren't going to be a thing anymore. So just thinking about the long-term game if you're going to be incorporating technology into it. All right.
Any other questions or comments? No? Well, we have, let me see. You can feel free to send either of us an email. I think, you know, we're happy to be an open book.
We did have one last question come in from Tasia. Do you get permitting for all your small signs in sensitive areas? I'm going to let you take that one, Mead.
Sure. Yeah, we do. So the sort of examples that I showed, we did get permitted the split rail fence in those locations, and that would incorporate the signage. So we do get permitting for that. That being said, if you're not causing any disturbance in the sensitive area, so if you're putting a sign, say, on a tree, or you have an already existing post, or, you know, something like that, you wouldn't need to do that. And then the last thing I'll just read from the chat is that, you know, Mike Huguenin mentions here that refreshing kiosk content twice a year, and I think that's a good rule of thumb. If you have kiosks on all of your properties, going out, you know, at least twice a year to make sure that you have everything that's relevant, it is going to be important, keeping up with them. So with that, I think we appreciate all the questions and comments, and on the slide here, we have both of our emails. Feel free to reach out with any further questions, comments, or, you know, even if you want, you know, guidance or to pass through a certain situation, we're happy to answer any questions you might have. And I just want to say thank you all for attending the session, and it was really great to hear the questions and have you all join us. So you know, this is kind of a unique Cape Cod convocation, but we're so glad that we could all get together virtually.
Thank you, guys.
Right.
Thanks for inviting me, Mead.
Of course. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.